I got out the door a little late this morning, so I'm trying to step it out a bit. But I mean, I'll still be at work, 50 minutes early, so I'll be fine. But as I'm walking, I'm thinking about, of all things that nobody wants to hear about, thinking about this 1672 sermon by Uriah Oakes and the problem that I have in wanting to argue that it shouldn't be read strictly metaphorically. His notion of Christian soldiers shouldn't be understood strictly as a metaphor, as some much more important, much more established people have argued. And, probably most importantly, most in their favor, as Uriah Oakes himself says of it, that it is metaphorical, that he's speaking metaphorically. And what I want to say is that it's unclear in his sermon what is metaphor and what isn't, and when he stops speaking metaphorically and when he continues speaking metaphorically. About this idea of the Christian soldier, and I want to say it should be understood in a more literal sense, even if he doesn't realize he's speaking that way. And so I've been struggling with this problem of how do I argue this, because the problem is it becomes me imposing my reading of the text onto it, which is something that I'm not entirely uncomfortable with. I tend to approach historical texts with a more philosophical influence and a more postmodern reading, I guess. So I'm not entirely uncomfortable saying that that it's okay to dismiss the author's own version of how you should read his text. I just think that I can't just dismiss it outright. I have to be able to give evidence for and support my saying that when Uriah Oakes says that he's speaking metaphorically, that he doesn't really understand what he's saying, and that we shouldn't just take his word for granted, just because he's the author of the text. And so yesterday morning I was making notes on some of the historical treatments of King Philip's War that I've read over the last month, and one of them is this book, originally published in 1958 by Douglas Leach, called New England During King Philip's War. I think that's the title, something like that. But this book is very, very much a book that was published in 1958. Leach holds on to some very some paradigms that very much emerge from the colonizer perspective, the European perspective. It's very ethnocentric. He says things like, it's obvious that the Indians of New England inhabited a lower rung of civilization than the colonists, the English colonists. So, it has these racialized, ethnocentric undertones to it. And it's very much, I think, very much promoting the good of the colonizer. The colonizer was a civilizing influence, and the Indians represented a way of life that just could not coexist with the more civilized colonizer. And civilized is a loaded term that really has no argumentative, no rational value. It's an emotional term, I would say, a value-laden term to give an emotional argument the appearance of rational discussion, but really it's subverting a rational assessment of this history. But anyways, in this very racist book, Leach talks about New England towns fortifying their meeting houses, and the way he describes it does exactly what I need, where it blends metaphorical and literal interpretation. The meeting house as the center of the community. Well, is that metaphorical? Is that literal? It's unclear. It's unclear. And it depends on the way in which the text, the discourse treating the meeting house, frames it. It can frame it as metaphorical. It's the spiritual center. It's a fortification against the lusts and the temptations of Satan, But then it's also the physical center. So much so that it is a building that's used for many different purposes, including in times of danger to be fortified and used as a safe house against Indian attacks. So, because, and this is probably the postmodernist reading in me, because it depends on how the text, how the discourse treating the meeting house is framed to interpret whether or not it's metaphorical or literal. The distinction becomes entirely irrelevant. It doesn't matter because it's synthetic. This is reaching back to Cassirer and his discussion of language and judgment being synthetic. Whichever writer is making a judgment, deciding, I'm going to use this metaphorically, but that doesn't mean that represents how the building actually exists in the community. It's just a synthetic judgment imposed on it in order to interpret it in the way that the writer needs, or that the speaker needs, to fulfill his rhetorical purposes. But really, not that it should be just like jettisoned and it doesn't matter, but I guess the important point is that because they're doing this, that doesn't make, so if you interpret it literally, that doesn't make the metaphorical use non-existent. You are just trying to put it in this imagined box and say, well, in this context, you can only understand it in this way. So you're putting an imposed limit on how the thing actually exists, how the symbol is actually used, even though there are many other uses. The building gets used for all kinds of things. And so, is it a metaphorical center or is it a literal center? Well, it's both. And it's always unclear which it is more than the other. And any clarity in which it is more than the other is imposed in order to serve the rhetorical purpose of the speaker or writer. And so you get the same thing with Urian Oakes's metaphor of the Christian soldier. Is it metaphorical? Is it literal? It's unclear. It's even unclear throughout Urian Oakes's own text. And when clarity is given to it, it's only to perform some rhetorical function, not because it is either or. Really, the metaphor of the Christian soldier is both metaphorical and literal. It's both in the same instance. It's a mythic symbol, and that's the way myth functions, is both at the same time. So just what what's bouncing around in my head on my way to work early in the morning.